The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster. And today, because we are in our academic era lately, I'm talking with Dr. Jenni Nuttall, who is the author of Mother Tongue, The Surprising History of Women's Words. We're talking about linguistics. We're talking about feminism. We're talking about the meaning of words. And it was so fascinating, this conversation I had with her. And her book is so timely in interesting and fun ways, but in also kind of like sorts of ways. Because like we're living in an era where conservative politicians are really mad about like pronouns and inclusive language. And books like this one really show like every word was just invented by someone at some time. Like words, they have meaning and they have significance, but to be like, how dare language change? It's like, it's always changing. It was such a fun conversation. And I'll just let you know a bit about Jenni. So Dr. Jenni Nuttall is an academic who has been teaching and researching medieval literature at the University of Oxford for the last 20 years, and who has thus had a lot of practice at making old words interesting. She has a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford and completed the University of East Anglia's Master's in Creative Writing. Mother Tongue is her first book for the general reader. I had such a good time talking with her. This book really, I don't know, the stuff that is in this book connects with what we've been talking about all along on this podcast. It really, as I mentioned, has a lot to do with some really, really annoying things that are happening lately with conservative politicians in multiple countries. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Jenni Nuttall. So I'm joined today by Jenni Nuttall. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. It's great to be asked to talk to you and your listeners.
Yeah. So when I first saw what your book was about, so my book, it's feminist history, basically. And I'm always interested in language and words. And so your book is exactly the sort of thing we like to talk about. Actually, can you first just explain, how do you describe your book to other people? What's it about?
So it's a it's a history of women's words in English, and particularly the kind of early history of women's words, starting out in Old English and medieval English into the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And I suppose that might then prompt the question, what do you mean by women's words? And I don't necessarily mean the words that women are using about themselves. I mean sets of vocabulary that are being used to talk about parts of women's lives and experiences, and to partly to kind of find out what's going on in the early stages of that language, which words that we've got coming all the way from the deep past of English to now, and which words have got lost, and just to kind of look at sets of vocabulary for women's bodies, the work they do, things like menstruation and pregnancy, and words for different stages of women's lives. So yeah, just a kind of a reaching back into the past for each of those sets of vocabulary to kind of see what's there and why.
There are a number of words that you talk about in your book that I think have particular resonances for this podcast, and phrases that come up here. And one of them is you talk about the different words and how it's developed in the English language to talk about breasts. And you say in your book that tit is the least worst of memory words. That's in your opinion. Can you talk about the development of the word, just the words that mean breasts, how that word has developed in English language?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, the book is full of kind of subjective opinions like that. It's me kind of looking at language from my position in language as a speaker of a certain kind of British English who grew up in a certain sort of culture, kind of testing out words. In Old English, you have words like breost, obviously, and tit, these words that come through into modern English. But I was sort of interested particularly in how changing ideas of register kind of join in. So if you might say if you're going to the doctor, I have a problem with my breast, but some of these words end up with a more kind of formal sense, and I'm interested in finding out a set of kind of synonyms. And if you reach into the past, you can get those synonyms. So you have breost and tit. You have a word like pap, which even though we might think of that as a word for baby food, it starts off as a word for the breast, and that's where the connection with kind of babies eating comes in. And then you have to name parts of the breast, the forward tit, the pap head, and eventually in the 16th century you get nipple coming in. So it's just sort of, I think, reaching back into the past allows you to kind of play around with choices as well. What if we'd ended up with that one and not this word? And tit, particularly in my kind of British English, is a good sort of plain spoken. You might say it's as cold as a witch's tit if you were trying to explain how kind of freezing cold it was one morning. So I was interested that word is there back in the past. It's not just a kind of slang word, and it's part of this phase of English where you often have several synonyms of kind of vaguely similar registers. You don't quite get that stratification of kind of polite words and impolite words that you get later on.
Well, and talking about female body parts as well, you have a whole chapter that's about kind of female reproductive body parts and the words used for them. But even just the word vagina was very interesting to me, how you talk about just the various medical textbooks, mostly written by men, and which terms ended up kind of catching on and which didn't. Like the word vagina, you could describe it has to do with a sword in a sheath, right?
Yeah, it's used in Latin treatises describing some of the new findings of anatomical dissection when that kind of gets going in a big way in the 16th century, and it's just in there really as an analogy. This body part to describe it. So if you're an anatomist for your readers, you will want to describe for your readers who haven't kind of been there and seen a dead body, but will want to kind of, I mean, they will know it in their own lives, but you're trying to kind of describe it. And vagina, yeah, it's just that word for sheath or scabbard of a sword. And it's to describe a kind of reciprocal function, as a sword goes into a scabbard. And it's not really presented even as a new technical term, I don't think, but somehow it gets kind of pulled out and becomes the standard term, and before that things have been a bit vaguer in a way. So you have wound gates or kind of ports or wickets. But it's interesting that to me that it's very sexist, that idea of it, that it what the vagina is the thing in relation to the male anatomy. But that's quite a late idea, and it's quite an accidental idea, which is not to say that the whole history of these textbooks isn't full of kind of misogyny, but often you can kind of find surprises in the histories of these words. And every time I kind of thought I knew something when I was setting off to research each chapter, I would suddenly think, oh, that's a much stranger story than I thought it was. And then behind that there were other words, and it can make it, which are we describing, whose perspective are we describing this body part from? And the 16th century writers who are interested in opening up discussions of childbirth and pregnancy and kind of communicating that to women readers in English are using a different set of words. They're not using vagina to start off with. They're talking about kind of gates and doorways and passages. It's still metaphorical, but it's a different set of metaphors.
Can you talk about the thing with nymphs in regards to female anatomy?
Yeah, I mean, and that's coming out of ancient classical Greek medical treatises, and that writing as it's kind of being translated into different languages is coming across. But it's one of the, again, it's a little bit hazy. Some of these male writers are not very good at kind of accurate descriptions of that part of women's anatomy. And like as we do these days with technical terms, people kind of muddle things up and overlap things. But yeah, an early alternative name for what we would call the labia is nymph, and it's where later on that idea of kind of nymphomania comes from. But that's a much later coinage, and here it's just part of, again, this slightly kind of flowery. Rather, I wasn't expecting the language of Renaissance anatomists to be quite so wonderful, and particularly the English writers who are taking these Latin findings and kind of bringing them across into English for a kind of popular audience. And they labia, lip, because it looks like, there is a comparison there with the lips of the mouse, or actually the edges of a wound, which perhaps seems a bit more of a kind of sexist idea. But even though nymphs is rather flowering, it's explained in this lovely way that just like nymphs in mythology guard fountains, here are the kind of nymphs down by your waterworks. That might be a way to say it. But again, why isn't it nice to have these sets of alternatives to kind of play around with that come out of these kind of early Englishes?
Well, and then I think that was one of the many examples in your book, but when you learn about what the words used to mean and you look at some of these old writings, you talk a lot about Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, or even some Shakespeare sonnets. You're like, oh, this is like a lot more sexual than I had realized. Just because you see a word like nymphs, you're like, okay, nymphs. But then to them, it had this very specific connotation that makes it like actually extremely sexual, where to us, it seems more like, oh, that's sort of a metaphor he's doing.
Yeah, and kind of wings, and then because they're very good at using this. It's not very sort of super accurate, but there is a kind of lovely metaphorical language for all this stuff. And again, it's not quite as sort of misogynist or sexist. There are strands of that kind of thinking all the way through the periods I'm interested in, but there are also much more appreciative descriptions of kind of women's body parts, in these anatomical treatises, and in there's a wonderful text called the Woman's Book, written in the middle of the 16th century to talk to readers about pregnancy and gestation. And then yes, in the kind of the punning literary text, if you understand this early set of vocabulary, you can see that the past isn't simply ashamed to talk. I mean, they are called the pugenda. They are sometimes called parts that are to do with shame, but not always. They always have a kind of a multifaceted identity, and you can find that if you look at different words.
And what I found really interesting about your book as well is that every time you're looking at one of these words and how it's used, it explains sort of how that was seen in society, like what it means to history. So as an example, So like use of the word hysterical, you talk about where that comes from. And I'd heard before about this sort of idea of the wandering womb and stuff, but you sort of dive into that and like, where did the word come from? Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, the words as ways to write almost kind of paragraph by paragraph, little kind of mini. It's not structured like something like Raymond Williams's keywords say, where you have kind of separate chapters. But each time I got to a word, I wanted to unpack it. And yeah, there's another example of something that perhaps feminist history might hold up and say, look, hasn't the history of the word hysteria been such a kind of long history of sexism? And that's true, but it's slightly more complicated than that. So we don't get hysterical in English until the beginning of the 17th century, and we don't get hysteria in English till midway through the 18th century. And that's because that diagnosis and the kind of groups of symptoms and the ways of thinking that fit around those words change quite a lot. So Plato might suggest that the womb is wandering, but even early on, medical writers and writers who know their anatomy are going, no, that's completely impossible. We can see it kind of tethered by ligaments. What are you talking about? So there's a kind of complicated story there. And is the thing that people are describing early on something that gets called the suffocation of the mother? So a more physical idea that things can go wrong with the womb and make the rest of you feel very unwell. And I can think of various modern complaints where that might seem a perfectly kind of reasonable idea. And it doesn't necessarily always have quite the kind of misogynist connections with the idea that women are kind of crazy and their wombs are wandering around. That those come and go in history. So in the 17th and 18th century, people are able to say, oh, the thing we call melancholic or kind of these nerve disorders in men it's the same thing in women, but we give it a different name, and that there's a much more nuanced understanding of these terms. And then it's only quite late on. One of the scholars calls it a kind of great forgetting, the eclipsing of that more complicated history in the 19th century, where you get a bit more of that familiar cliche of the kind of hysterical woman, and it all comes together. But I was so interested that you would think hysteria would be the easiest word to trace back as a word and idea deep into kind of the history of medicine, and it is, and I one of the things I wanted to do a little bit in the book, as well as writing a very feminist book that was kind of standing up for women in the past and kind of highlighting sex in the past, but I also wanted to make the feminist history really accurate and really nuanced, to say, look, there are all those ideas we kind of grow up with as baby feminists, but they're always generally a kind of simplified version of a more interesting narrative. And the first use of hysterical in English is used to say that a woman might be hysterical, might not therefore be a witch or influenced by witchcraft. So that it's there as a kind of useful medical idea. No, don't decide she's a witch. Actually, she may have this kind of long held diagnosis of the suffocation of the mother, and we might call that hysterical, and then it comes into English. So I was interested in sort of balancing up moments in the past where you have a kind of more enlightened way of thinking about things versus our sense of the kind of sexism of the past, and that's all there in the history of hysteria.
And it's really interesting too, in so many of the words you talk about in your book, and how it really made me think about the power of words. Like, we're seeing it so strongly these days right now with people getting upset about pronouns, or describing people as a woman, or describing as like people who menstruate, and people like the power and just the way that words reflect a societal view, I guess. It's more clear to me now because of some of these debates than maybe it would have been a couple of years ago. And you do mention that in your book. It's a history of women's words, but you do talk about the use of the word woman versus the use of the word like people with a uterus and things like that. Can you expand upon how you talk about that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it just at the end, and I think it was one of sort of watching those debates play out was one of the several things came together in the writing of this book, but I was sort of suddenly more conscious of the vocabularies that were being kind of changed or replaced to do with things like menstruation or pregnancy, and it made me interested in all of those words. It's something I'm still kind of working my way through as an idea, the kind of balance between including and acknowledging. And I talk about this in the introduction a little bit, that there will be people who wouldn't categorize themselves as women, but will need and use a lot of the kind of sets of vocabulary I'm interested in the book. So that's exactly right. But it is interesting to see the kind of unintended perhaps consequence of that, which is to see a word like woman disappearing out, not in a kind of, it's not that we can't say it anymore, but in certain types of public health messaging or a certain way of writing a journal article about something, that the words like women and woman and girls might be sort of circumvented, kind of written out somehow, and that's quite significant in a way. So I was interested in not really trying to solve those questions, but thinking about as you say, the kind of the way in which culture and language interact with each other, and how even those usage choices there reflect these kind of tricky balances that we're trying to do. I could see both at the same time. Women's all sorts of issues relating to women and their lives and experiences are being represented and articulated at the same time as we're sort of changing or needing also to do something else at the same time with that language. So it's a kind of interesting space to be thinking about. But I think what I'm really doing, if I'm honest, is kind of retreating to the past and saying, right, there's all this going on, but let's go back and kind of see what's nearer the source, the origins of English. Yeah, so it just sort of frames the book, I think.
Well, no, exactly. And it's more, you use it in the book as an example of how words have power, how words interact with a society. Your book is very much, as you described it at the beginning of this interview, how were things about women written in the past. But another weird way, and I say weird, just kind of unexpected, but also kind of distressing, that some of this terminology is interacting with our current world, as you do mention in the book about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, which is using some, to me, quite obscure language about menstruation and about fetal development. Can you talk about that for a bit? And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen Podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
Yeah, again, it's one of those patterns where things become much more kind of fixed and regulated later on in the story, and going earlier on in history and earlier on in language lets you see a kind of picture where more uncertainty is possible. So some of the legal debates that have been going on with the courts, as far as I understand it, go back to kind of precedents, and one of the issues there is what does say a 17th or 17th or 18th century writer mean by quickening, say the moment where the baby moves in the womb? What do they mean by misprision? What do they mean by fertility? Kind of how are they positioning abortion? And again, a bit like the history of hysteria, where it's quite easy to get the kind of wrong end of the stick and simplify history. Telling the story of the early history of which kinds of abortion are prosecuted and why and when is took an awful lot of research. It's not a kind of hugely heavily footnoted book, but there's a lot going on under the surface. I read for each of these chapters to try and kind of get the story straight. And the earliest prosecutions are to do with pregnant women being injured and having what we might think of as a miscarriage. And there's quite a long. Then it's recognised that doesn't really work, because it's very difficult to kind of know the legal personhood status of the kind of fetus in the womb, and what you see is that there's an understanding that this is very much a kind of woman-centered knowledge, as it were. This is before our world of kind of scans and dates and everything. The kind of the moment of quickening is something that sort of inside out, and that the law and society is not so easily going to be able to kind of intervene in and kind of make pronouncements about. And that there's a real caution and recognition of doubt in some of the early writings about, when can we say this is a crime, and when can we say the fetus has a soul? And so it's so interesting to see some of the kind of legal debate, which appears to be so certain that the past agrees with you on something, where it's a much more complicated story, even coming down to kind of what does that writer mean by that word, I think.
Yeah, I think it's so useful and so important to have a book like yours that explains how the same word has meant different things through the years. So for somebody today to see that word and be like, well, for sure it means this, where people in all different cultures and contexts were using it in different ways. So language is so fluid, and I think that's important for people to recognize.
Yeah, and that's sort of underpinning some of the arguments that people are having today. I keep wanting to kind of do the most simple kind of linguistics media lecture and say there's this thing called polysemy. We recognize that one word can have several related meanings, but then you need to look at usage and context and try and kind of work out which is going on. And it might be that I was quite keen this is not simply a book of kind of definitions of things, because defining the idea that words have a kind of, that either history or semantics will give you a kind of core, central, stable meaning. That's not how it works. It's always, as you say, a kind of different parts of society using words slightly differently and kind of contested meanings. And even this very weird thing that language does, which is to have kind of you can think of a word like wench, which can mean it can be used just straightforwardly for a young woman of a certain type of social status, but then also has a pejorative meaning, and the two kind of sit alongside. And even when you're reading Shakespeare, you're thinking, okay, they do relate to each other. It's not accidental that they have a kind of related meaning, but there will always be a sense of kind of negotiation between meaning. Yeah, certainly even we keep words to do with abortion, words to do with miscarriage separate now, as we absolutely should, and that those are much more overlapping and intertwined and complicated in the past. And again, it makes the legal history of this somewhere where you can't just jump back in and kind of grab a phrase and say that's what that means.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that's part of why it just seems preposterous to me to be making a legal decision now saying, well, in 1642 they said this, where it's like, well, a lot of context has changed since then.
Yes, and bad scholarship too. I think she's Carla Spivak, if I'm named right. She's written a very good article about the kind of complexity of the early history of there've been some really good history research, and it's really sort of the worst kind of cherry picking to kind of cite Hale or someone like that without kind of looking at because those legal writings are sort of processing the sort of stuff I'm particularly interested in, the kind of medieval, early modern history of some of the ideas. They're just looking at kind of descriptions of cases in law books and thinking, like we are, kind of what does that mean? How should we understand it?
Well, and even a definition, this one also, after I read your book, I was talking to my friend and I kept giving my friend examples. I'm like, did you know this? And did you know this? It was a sort of book where I just enjoyed learning so many facts. But one that I found interesting, I was hoping you can talk about, is the word husband and how it relates to the word housewife and how those interact with each other.
Yeah, and even now, I don't think that the sort of connotations of housewife and the connotations of husband, which you can see are kind of related. Obviously, we have husband and wife, and yeah, I mean, coming back in origin to the sort of, in most circumstances, the two people, the man and the woman who are running the domestic economy of a house, some kind of, whether that's a kind of little house or a kind of bigger unit, but that kind of domestic family unit. So we would recognize a word like husbandry. There's that funny phrase, animal husbandry, which means the kind of looking after of farm animals very well. And that word husbandry and housewifery, the thing that housewives do. So the we for the house, the bondman, the kind of retained worker who's living in a house. Not a kind of equal status, and they don't mean the same thing, but they mean the kind of the related activities that is to do with the running of the household, but more in the sense of the kind of economic functioning, as it were, getting the stuff you need to live and running a household. It's funny then that housewifery eventually becomes reduced to cleaning and cooking and these more domestic things, but it used to have a much broader meaning, a kind of equivalent to husbandry, to do with the kind of the skill and knowledge and power, social power needed to kind of not just generally a household. It might be a very small household of two, but as everyone will know, earlier on in history, kind of bigger households with servants, with children, to run those things. And you even find men in the Paston letters, those medieval letters, sort of saying, oh, if you get a really good deal on some complicated sort of wood bargaining interaction, you're being a great housewife, they say to one another, because it's got these kind of connotations of being part of a kind of a system of kind of finance and economy, and without the kind of the separate spheres obviously comes along a lot later and kind of starts to push these words in different directions. But yeah, you can think of husbandry and housewifery, husband, housewife, as the kind of pair at the start.
Well, and that's so fascinating to me. I'd never heard any of that until I read your book. And just the current context, there's people who want, quote unquote, a return to the role of the housewife or a traditional housewife. And it's like, well, if we were doing that, then if we're actually going back to the traditional housewife, then what you were just saying, it's like household management. It's
Yeah, and maybe a bit closer to the sort of trad wives who are monetizing the business, who are making a lot of money out of it. Because the idea, that's what all of this early language acknowledges, that there's a lot of kind of economy, even economy goes back to the idea of kind of household in the Greek, and these housewiferys, Marjorie Kemp, that wonderful medieval mystic and traveller, writes in her book about at the start about how she's going to try a new housewifery, a kind of new housewifery, and you think, oh, I wonder what that is, and it involves a mill and a horse and an employee and all sorts of things. So housewifery, yeah, the Tradwives gang need to kind of somehow recognise that housewives are you do see there are certainly kind of gender segregated employments and within household kind of gender segregated tasks, but there is definitely a kind of recognition of the importance of things like kind of bargaining, money management, supplies, all of those things. No, they're certainly not decorative. These or kind of limited in what they do. Caxton has a lovely dialogue showing people how to kind of do certain kinds of public speaking, and one of the examples is a housewife in a market out in public, kind of bandying with all the stallholders and kind of getting the best deal. That's a housewife is a kind of larger than life person in history. I like.
And just as a final question, just because the name of this podcast is Vulgar History, and I did choose it because of the several meanings of the word vulgar. Can you mentioned in your book, I was really excited that he talked about English as the vulgar tongue. Can you explain that meaning of the word?
Yeah, and comes to the idea that the sort of the tongue of the common people, vulgus, and that it's there in that idea, the word vernacular too, that this is the language that most people speak in a nation, but not necessarily the language earlier on in English's history of education or of science, of knowledge, of law, things like that, and often associated with women, partly because predominantly because they're excluded in a patriarchal society from some of those spheres in which other languages, Latin and French, are used. But the vulgar tongue as the language of the home and education, your kind of first language, which often women are understood as the kind of first teachers of your language as you grow up as a child. And even when we get to the point of the first dictionaries being created for English on its own, they say in their prefaces, these might be useful for women who will need to get up to speed. Sometimes it's a bit of a kind of marketing spin because then you don't have to say, and actually we know all the chaps whose Latin and French is not very good at the moment might find, haven't got the kind of levels and education needed to kind of decode some of these words. But I was interested, that question, feminist linguistics, are we sort of excluded from this language despite ourselves somehow? Is it always going to be the kind of the oppressor's language somehow? Not quite. If you go back in the past, it's had lots of associations with women in terms of teaching English and good speech and bad speech, the gossipy speech and kind of uncontrolled speech and speech outside of institutions and establishments, but also a kind of a speech that because it's outside of those things, this is what I found so much as I was writing, is so kind of wild and unruly and surprising and kind of thinks on its feet. So I like the idea of it is a kind of I wanted to have both. There's the history of the kind of language that men used about women, but where I could find it, I wanted to find that kind of vulgar history. There's not much straight from the horse's mouth, but there are ways to kind of get back to that. When say in the Renaissance, physicians are writing for women, you start to kind of find some of these words that are not formal, what Ursula Le Guin calls the father's language, not the father's language, but what she calls the mother tongue. And that's why the book kind of has that name in a way, because I liked all those things coming together.
And also just in the sense of, the writing for the common people or the general public. The book, I think, is very much written for an everyday audience. You don't need to be a historian of linguistics to enjoy your book. And I assume that was your intention, because that's how it comes across.
Yeah, and it's written much more in the voice I kind of teach in. That was really fun to try and be funny and to try and explain things. And I wanted, it was kind of interesting to write because I wanted to explain a lot, and I didn't, as we've been talking about with hysteria, or the history of witchcraft, say, I didn't just want to kind of give the kind of easy, well-known version. I mean, I wanted it to be as kind of up to date and scholarly in its knowledge, but in its tone and in its writing, I wanted it to be like, midway through a tutorial in Oxford when I've kind of lost the plot a bit and I'm just kind of talking about the stuff I'm interested in, and I'm from rather kind of humble, common background really, and I just talk in the kind of words that seem kind of clearest and most expressive, and I make a lot of jokes when I teach, and it was so wonderful to have the opportunity to write a book like this, and have editors and presses that could see the value of that kind of balance between the very kind of accurate, informed stuff that's going on in there, but expressed in a way that hopefully was just really kind of joyful and clear and kind of easy to get in and out of, I think.
I'm sure anyone listening to this can hear your passion and your joy for talking about this subject matter. And I think it's great when someone finds so much delight in talking about a subject, to read a book that person has written just makes it more fun to read, because you can tell how much fun you had putting this together.
Yes. Even in the middle of a global pandemic in quite trying circumstances. But yeah, the book is and you must feel this too, that you don't want to kind of simply scold the past and tell the past off for being not as progressive as we are. I wanted to, because I teach this really ancient, old English, medieval English, students pitch up thinking, oh no, what? But I wanted to kind of to show how much fun you could have with it, definitely. And yeah, and I like the idea of, people have said that to me, this sort of book that you're reading and then you're kind of annoying the person next to you. You're like, can I just tell you this thing that I've just read?
No, exactly. I have one of my coworkers. I get a ride home from work some days with her, and I spent the whole commute just being like, "And this? And did you know the history of the word husband? And did you know the history of the word vagina?" I was just like, "This, that." Like, I couldn't stop telling her all these fun facts. So yeah, it's that sort of book, definitely. So when this podcast comes out, the book will have just been published, I believe, in North America, as well as, is it already out in the UK, or is it coming out everywhere all at the same time?
No, it's already been out. So I have two different publishers. It's come out with Virago, that great feminist press, and it came out at the end of May in the UK. But yeah, Viking in the States at the end of August. I've ended up with sort of two different dates, but it's quite nice. It spreads the fun.
Well, it keeps it going for you, so you can keep talking about it with different people. So I wanted to ask, so if listeners are interested in you and your work, do you have any, I don't know, do you have a website, or are you on social media or anything where people can just see what you're doing?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. I didn't get the memo that you should have a really easy to explain Twitter handle. I was just kind of somewhere else when that happened. So you can search for my name, but my Twitter handle is stylisticienne, which is just impossible. It's kind of she who studies stylistics in French. And I have a website, but the website is rather before I started doing this, I was writing a lot about kind of medieval poetry in its form. So the website is mostly that. But I think the dying wastelands of Twitter are currently the best place to find me, and maybe go somewhere else if it just falls over completely.
That's what's interesting about recording these a bit earlier. Like, if Twitter still exists when this episode comes out, that's where you'll be. But it's good. I'll put all the links to your website and everything in the show notes so people can track you down as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this. Like, as I said, when I heard about your book, I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I read your book and I thought, oh, I really hope I get a chance to talk to Jenni about this, because it just sounds like exactly the sort of thing that I think the listeners are so interested in. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk.
So again, this wonderful book, now available in North America and also other places, I assume, is called Mother Tongue and the Surprising History of Women's Words by Jenni Nuttall. And my name is Ann Foster, and this is Vulgar History, feminist women's history comedy podcast. Sometimes I do interviews with authors like this. Sometimes it's just me talking. Sometimes it's me with a special guest. You never know what you're going to get with this podcast, and that's how it is going to always be. So, get on board. That's what I'm doing. Anyway, so you can keep up with me in this podcast at, God knows, social media, what is even happening. I am most active on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. That's where you can find me. But if you're using another social media thing, like Threads or Blue Sky or whatever, look up Vulgar History. I'm probably there. And if I start seeing there's a lot of people there to interact with, maybe I'll start being there more. But at this point, Instagram is where you can find me mostly. And you can also get in touch with me. I'm always excited. If you have a book to recommend, an author you think you'd like me to talk to, or just honestly a book you think I'd like to read, you can reach out to me in my DMs, or also if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's a contact form there, or you can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I have merch available 2 different places. If you're in the US, what tends to work best is if you go to vulgarhistory.com/store, or if you're outside the US, shipping is better if you use the Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. In many places, we're getting ready for back to school season, which I personally think is a good time to get a sticker or a t-shirt that says scholarly and rambling, which is a thing that I was once accused of being. And you can get that at the merch store. Anyway, you can also support the podcast on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, and if you just donate some money every month, then you get different levels of bonus stuff. So if you join the Patreon for at least $1 a month, then you get early ad-free access to all the episodes, including older episodes. And if you pledge at least $5 or more a month, then you get access to the ad-free episodes, as well as bonus episodes. You can hear my episodes of So This Asshole, where I just read Men for Filth, the horrible men from history. We also have Vulgar Peace Theater, which are 3-hour-long episodes I do with my friends Lana and Allison, where we talk about costume dramas. And most recently, in terms of Patreon, there's also a Discord. So for everyone who joins at the $5 or more level at Patreon, you get to join the Vulgar History Salon, which is a Discord, which is basically just a big group chat lately. And I don't know if it'll finish by the time you hear this episode, but one of our Patreon members, Miguel, has been running a sim that's what if some of the greatest heroines of vulgar history were playing the TV reality show Survivor, and who would win? And it's just been a really fun time. Anyway, so you get access to all of that if you join the Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. I do want to mention that if and when I get to 500 members of the Patreon, I will do a So This Asshole episode on John Knox. But because that'll emotionally take a lot out of me, I need to be persuaded. Anyway, I think that's everything. Next week, we're going to be back with a finale of the Mary Queen of Scots season, and I'll give you an update of what to expect next from this podcast. So that's all coming up next week. And until then, everybody, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Morachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The Heresies of Redolf Bantwine, wherever podcasts are available.